Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. But don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide open country that I love. But don't fence me in. Let me be by myself in the evening breeze. Listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me off forever, but I ask you please. Don't fence me in, just turn me loose. Let me straddle my...
Welcome. Hope everybody survived the snow and the cold in good order. Today we are going to be speaking about a topic that rarely gets addressed within the context of economics or even in social teaching. But as we will see, it is a key topic that needs to be discussed. So let's jump right into it. The topic is property, culture, and economics. And we'll be discussing it from a variety of standpoints. We'll start right here. Property as the foundation of wealth. Now, think about it. What are the factors of wealth creation? Well, in fact, there are only two. There's the gifts of nature and the labor of man. That's it. All wealth comes from the application of the labor of man to the gifts of God. There are no other sources. Now, the gifts and labor. The gifts include land, obviously, natural resources, basically anything not made by man. So things like the electromagnetic spectrum. Labor includes physical labor, obviously, but also intellectual labor, organizational, management expertise. Land, however, is the primary gift. All labor requires land. You must have somewhere to stand to be able to work at all. Hence, control of the land will equal control of labor. Hence, property is the most basic social relation, as well as the most primary economic. However, property, especially in land, was the primary focus of economic theory until the late 19th century. But in the new science of economics, it became just another commodity, and it disappeared into the capital fund. So it lost its special status. However, without understanding land, we really cannot understand culture, economics, or politics. So let's look at property and culture. Think about ownership. Ownership is the right to grant usage. You could grant it to yourself or you could grant it to somebody else. And usually, not always, but often, it's the right to collect a rent. Now, this right is regulated according to some notion of justice. So property is always the institutional expression of a culture's notion of justice. It's not a fixed idea. Different cultures have different definitions and extensions and rules of property. So it varies widely from culture to culture. Now, you cannot reduce culture to economics, but neither can you divorce them. Property is always the most basic and primary social relationship, and the most basic economic one. Everything will depend on the laws of ownership and use. The modern discussion of property starts with John and what I call the Lockean myth. And with Locke, the discussion of property got flattened to a discussion of public versus private ownership. So we start with John Locke's second treatise on government, 1680. And the modern discussion goes back no further than. So in the Lockean myth, property is taken from nature by private owners. Now originally it's limited to what the owner could use by his own work. However, when we started using money, according to Locke, then the use of money justified inequality in property. Now notice, according to Locke, originally you could only own what you could use. Okay, so everybody has about the same amount. And the reason for this was, well, the produce of the land is perishable. So what's the point of building up a surplus? With money, he says, you can build up a surplus. Therefore, you can own more property than you can use. And anybody who uses money, according to Locke, is at the same time agreeing to the unequal division of property. Okay. However, the reality is otherwise. This is not how property. The historical reality. Property is always colonized not by individuals, but by groups, tribes, usually migrations, and usually migrations following behind armies. Now, the community allocates property to families in sufficient quantity for their self-support and independence, but not more than that. So what you have historically is a progression in types of property. And there are 5 types: communal, personal, private, collective, and cooperative. Private property is always a product of government. And all actual titles trace to the right of common. So, we stand on this hill because the Americans took it from the Mexicans, and the Mexicans took it from the Spanish, and the Spanish took it from the Apache, and the Apache took it from the Mandan, or whoever was the aboriginal tribe that first occupied the University of Dallas campus. Now, if you examine any chain of title in the state of Texas, you will find that all chains of title begin with a grant of land from the King of Spain to Don Jose Martinez, Antonio Rodriguez, etc., etc. Or it traces back to a grant of land from the Republic of Texas to John Smith. That is, it always traces back to an action of some conqueror. What's true for Texas is true universally. Every piece of land originates in this conquest. Well, let's talk about the 5 types of property. First is communal. The ownership is within the community. Now, this is the most basic type of property. So when a tribe occupies a new space, the tribe owns the land. And this is expressed in village property, tribal property, and it carries in even into the Middle Ages, where the king is technically the owner of all property. In fact, even today, Queen Elizabeth II technically owns all property within England, Ireland, Scotland, and throughout the Commonwealth. Now, she is not able to exercise any rights of ownership, but it's interesting that this little stub of the old law still remains as part of English law. The community, either acting through the village, the tribal leaders, or the king, allocate use of land to individuals or mostly to families. But there's land still held in common. So these are common lands which are used for grazing animals or Woodlands are usually common, so people have a right to cut down so many trees. Then comes personal property. Now, personal property is a limited right. It's limited to what the family can actually use. So they can only own property that they can use. They cannot rent out property. And they own enough property, in theory, for their economic vitality and independence. Now, if the community charges anything, it will be fixed fees rather than economic rents. Hold on to that idea of economic rents because we're going to come back. All right, next, we get private property. Now, private property contrasts with personal property in that it is an unlimited right. You can own as much as your wits can let you acquire. Now, this leads to economic rents because obviously you own more property than you can use, so to make it pay, you have to rent it out. And we'll see why property and land is always an economic rent. The private property is always a precursor to collective property. Why? Because after you own so much land, you cannot manage it. And the property tends to get combined into vast collectives. We'll see how this works a little later. Collective is the next. So, collective property has many owners. So if you think of state property, technically the people own it. But the more important part is corporations. Corporations are owned by stock. But they have very little to do with the actual management of the property. Because effective use, whether it's government collectives or corporate collectives, is always in the hands of a managerial. And control in this type of property is always top-down. So the managers are the effective users of the property, hiring employees and reporting in some way to the putative owners of the property. And finally, there is cooperative property. Now, the difference between a cooperative and a collective is that in a cooperative, owners of personal property join their properties together for some larger enterprise. And in this case, control is bottom up because the owners and the users of the property are the same people. So they are in control of the cooperative, some outside group of managers. All right. Now there's an arc of history. If you check in the textbook, it'll go into some detail about this history. But history shows a consistent pattern almost in every culture. Land begins in communal ownership. This communal ownership then passes to family ownership. This leads to the creation of class systems and aristocracy. Gradually, land loses all its social obligations and just becomes a way of making more money. Fees, the customary fees on land, become economic. Notice how often that term comes up. And it tends to get accumulated in fewer and fewer hands. And the people get reduced to either job dependency or outright serfdom. Now, we have to make a distinction here between man-made and natural property. Man-made property. Man-made property belongs to the man who made it. Everybody agrees on that. Even Karl Marx agrees with that statement. But to the degree that he owned all the inputs. But very, very little is the result of one man's labor. It involves natural input of nature, and it usually involves social input. So to produce anything, we need a social system capable of providing roads, providing national defense, providing police protection, providing things like sewers and other infrastructure. So disputes over man-made property concern the allocation of benefits among those who had a hand in their creation. But the bigger problem is with natural. Who owns the thing that man cannot make? And so how should we allocate land or other natural resources? Say the electromagnetic spectrum. Should we do it by the tribe for the good of family? That would be tribalism. By the aristocrats for the good of the community? That would be aristocracy. By the state for the good of the people, with, say, Marxism. By the market to increase profits, capitalism. Or by some combination of them. Now, different answers are going to be given by different cultures. We have to talk about two things when we in regard to property, and that's ownership and use. Okay? Use is not the same as ownership, obviously. It should be noted that the separation of ownership and use is always and everywhere the product of government. If you can't call the cops, you can't collect the rent. So rent is always, excuse me, a result of this separation of ownership and use. Now, rents for man-made goods are obvious. But what about the goods made by God? We have to discuss too natural and conventional property. Now, men and women have a natural claim to the fruits of their labor. But what about the things created by God? These are allocated by convention or by positive law. You've seen Locke's first use arguments. They're interesting, but they have no application. There is not one piece of property, certainly not in this country, and probably not on the face of the earth, that traces back to first use. All physical property traces back to the right of conquest. Now, we can ask, is there some better basis? All right, well, let's ask this guy. Okay, because this is UD, as you know, I talk about this at least once in every lecture. So, property and the natural law. And we'll be taking Thomas Aquinas' view of natural law. Now, St. Thomas gives a very pragmatic defense of private property. He says that people take care of their own things better than they do property. And things are more orderly when each person has something of their own to care for. And there's more peace when people are contented with their own thing. Nevertheless, property remains common by natural law. Private property, says St. Thomas, is a human addition to the natural law. But in cases of extreme necessity, a man may take the property of another with or without their knowledge and consent. That's rather a startling conclusion for us, isn't it? What do you think? Is this just a justification of theft? Well, Thomas says that in cases of extreme need, property reverts to its common state. Necessity, he says, makes all things. Okay, let's think about this because it's a very important point. So suppose you are, you're trapped in the flood of New Orleans. And it doesn't. No help is on the way. So you can't get out. everything's flooded, but across the street there is a grocery store. Would you break into that grocery store and take bread and provisions for your family to survive? You think? Well, I would, that's for sure. So necessity makes that bread common, makes those cans of tuna fish common. And yes, in those circumstances, you can indeed appropriate that property. Now, of course, in cases like this, there's also looting that goes on. So people take not only bread, they take, a big screen TV. Well, in fact, that is theft because you don't really need a big screen TV. Matter of fact, it has been scientifically proven that people can go for days without watching television. That's a big thesis, but it's true. It's true. Can't argue with science on that one. But so the television wasn't necessary, but the bread certainly is necessary to the survival of your family. So yes, in those circumstances where there's no other source, you may indeed. Okay, Thomas proposes, as set up here, this kind of tension between private property and the natural law of common property. So he leaves us with a dilemma. His resolution is to distinguish ownership and use. Things, he says, may be owned privately, but they must be used as if they were common property. That is, they must be freely communicated to those in need. Now, this doesn't solve the problem, but it does give us some steps. A legal system, for example, that allocated property so as to create rather than alleviate property would seem to violate principle. Natural property and economic. Okay, we've been using this term economic rents. Now we're going to see what it actually is. Think about two kinds of rent: capital rent and ground rent. Now, when you rent a car, you are paying for a man-made capital item. But when you rent a house, you are paying for two things. You are paying for the capital improvement, the house or the apartment, and you are paying for the ground rent, for the land underneath the house. They obey completely different. This brings us to the question of economic rent, which should be called anti-economic. Okay, it's defined as a payment to a factor of production in excess of what is necessary to keep it employed in its current use, or it's payment to a resource not consumed in the transaction. It is the primary measure of economic inefficiency. Well, think about land. Land has zero cost to keep it in production. I mean, no matter what you do or don't do to the land's still going to be there. So you don't mow the grass, well, the city may give you a fine, but the land will still be there. You build a factory on a piece of land, it lasts 20, 30 years, you take it down, the factory is gone, but the land is still there. It's not consumed. It's occupied, but not consumed in production. All right, so all ground rents are economic. This brings us to the law of rent. Now, this sounds weird and unbelievable, okay? But it is undisputed. It doesn't matter what economic view you take of the world, you're a capitalist, a communist, whether you follow Georgism, whether you follow Austrian economics, all sides agree on the law of rents. There is no dispute. However, most economists ignore it in their theorizing. They acknowledge it, but when they come actually to their economic theories, they put the law of rents aside because it really doesn't match most modern theories. And here's what the law of rent. Ground rent is equal to all the values over the margin of production. The margin of production is the least valuable parcel in use. Let me try to make this clear by giving an example. Imagine a very small country with exactly 6 parcels of land. Now, let us further imagine that this land, whatever parcel, has to produce at least 5 to be able to support. Doesn't matter, 5 bushels of wheat, 5 gold, 5 barrels of oil, whatever it might be. 5 is the minimum number that it must produce. So let's say this first parcel of land produces 3. The next one produces 5, the next one produces 10, the next one 15, the next one 20. Okay. So there's the distribution of property in this very, very small. Now, nobody's going to work the parcel that produces only 3. It has no value. All right, so that's the margin of production. And at the margin of production, you have this property that produces 5. There can be no rent on that property. You charge a rent, nobody can work it. That's the least someone must make, so a property that produces 5 cannot collect a rent. But the property that produces 10 gets everything over that margin of. So 10 minus 5, the rent is 5. And for the property that produces 15, well, it gets everything over 5. 15 minus 5, it gets 10. And 15 and 20. All right, if we were in class together, I'd get 6 students, and I'd have them bid on properties. And a student who can't make at least 5, starves to death, or at least gets an F for that. Well, of course, everybody bids up the land to just what I've shown here. There's no other choice. It can't work any other way. So, ground rent equalizes returns to both capital and labor, all parcels. Capital and labor together share what's left over at ground rent. So labor and capital earn 5 on each parcel for a total of 25. But landlords landlords get, maybe I shouldn't use the term earn. Landlords get 5 plus 10 plus 15 plus 20. Landlords get 50. Question: what has the landlord contributed to production? Now we come to the question of the unearned increment. The price of land increases with increases in population and off-site improvement. So as the population of a city goes up, the price of land goes up with it. As more improvements surround a piece of property, the price of that property goes up. No, it's the off-site improvements, not the on-site improvements that increase the ground rent. You might increase the capital rent by putting a building on the property, but you don't increase the ground rent. But you do increase the ground rent of your neighbors. Think about this. You own, say, a hot dog. You own a little piece of property with a hot dog stand. Across the street, someone builds a big office. Well, the price of your land goes up. Why? It's going to get, your hot dog stand is going to get more traffic. It's going to be a more valuable piece of property. So someone building that building increased the price of your land. You didn't increase the price of your land. The person who built the building increased the price of it. Or say you owned a field out in the country, and the county comes by and puts a road that borders your property. All of a sudden, your property is more valuable, even though you didn't do anything. Think about this. Take an identical set of blueprints for, say, an office. Build this identical building, East Muleshoe, Texas, in downtown Dallas, and on the island of Manhattan. Well, which one is going to get more rent? Well, obviously, the building in East Muleshoe is going to collect the lowest rent. Then comes Dallas, then comes the building in Manhattan. The difference cannot be due to the capital improvement. It can only be due to the increase in the land value. Now note, the landlord had nothing to do with those increases in value. They happened because the population rose or because there was lots of off-site improvements. But the landlord gets the entire increase in value. So he or she profits from the work of others without having to contribute anything himself. This is called the unearned increment. So the moral question is this. The unearned increment represents wealth without work. And we know that where there is wealth without work in one place, there must be work without wealth in another place. It represents an irreducible inefficiency in any economy subject to economic rents. And it allows one class to accumulate wealth without providing anything. Right. Let's then talk about some current problems. First, you have the concentration of ownership. Now, only ownership of land allows either capital or labor to get its full values. Otherwise, they have to pay rent. And only ownership of land confers economic freedom. But ownership has now been concentrated in huge corporations. That is, they're mostly owned collective. Excuse me. Back again. Here's a great irony. First, this is not real ownership. I mean, so I own dozens and dozens of corporations for my portfolios. I don't even know their name. I have no responsibility for their operation. But legally, I'm the owner. It's hard to say that this is real ownership, because real ownership involves some responsibility for what you own. Now, the great irony is we talk a lot about private property, but it actually plays only a small role in an economy. The major property, the major sources of production and distribution and exchange are in corporate properties, collective properties. And the owners of these properties are the ones least attached to the enterprise. I mean, I couldn't even tell you the names of the companies that are in my stock, much less what they do. Now, when the economy is so concentrated in these corporate collectives, you have diminished competition. So, for example, the meat packing industry is basically 4 firms. The beer business is basically 1 firm. And you'll find that all over. Banking is maybe 2 firms. They have larger banks, but pretty much the control of the American economy in the hands of two banks. And you'll find that in sector after. So you get diminished competition and you get less. And property becomes very, very abstract. And use is increasingly divorced from ownership, as in the example of my stock portfolio. Then there's barriers to ownership are raised, especially in the developing world. So, the developing world, and I think if you read the textbook, you'll look at the case of Peru. So people have been on their land for generations. They have long-standing use, but no legal ownership. Land loses its social obligation. The land was considered, in aristocratic societies, land was considered also a social obligation. It had certain obligations to the public. Well, these are all gone. So land just becomes commodity, just another form. And this leads to land speculation. Now, we'll deal with that in another discussion. We get to discussing usury. But since the price of land, so long as the population is going up, the price of land is going up, this leads people to speculating, further driving. So right now, about 14% of all housing is owned by corporations, giving up the price of housing. But there's something deeper, a much issue, and it's the issue I call place versus land. Has always been a place where families are formed, communities subsist, a place where the dead are buried. So it has more than monetary value. It has family, social, and religious value. Converted into real estate, this place becomes simply a space that can be infinitely subdivided and divorced from all non-economic values. So place loses its claims against space. And this works against the family and against the community. Think about property and the political order. The division of property is the most important political question. It's the question that every society, every culture, every government, and it's the most basic social and economic question. The economic system is most tied to the land. So we are in sort of a constant debate between socialism and the free market. You hear that forever. So on one hand, all property is socialized. On the other, all property is privatized. I am going to say that this is a sterile and unresolvable debate. Reality is somewhat different. Public and private land interdepend. All markets depend on a vast array of socialized services, and all public services depend on the market for. Think about this. It doesn't matter how good you become making a profit. If there are no roads to carry it to market, you will not be successful. If every entrepreneur had to drill his own well, dig his own latrine, provide his own security services, educate his own employees, customers, well, he'd simply have no time to attend to it. He depends on these all being in place before he opens a business. So problems arise when one term tries to displace, when you try to make everything public. This leads to the destruction of both. Neither can stand on their own. So where the debate really should lie should be about a debate about boundaries. What is the proper role of the community and the proper role of the market in this situation? That is, it's not an answer that can be given in it. You have to look at a particular situation, make a decision about this particular configuration. So the standard of judgment is which combination best contributes to the common good. So take the example that everybody's fighting now, healthcare. Should healthcare be entirely public? Should it be entirely private? Should it be employer-based? Should employers be required to cover the cost? Should it be insurance-based? Should we rely so much on insurance companies? Or should it just be laissez-faire? If you got it, if you got the cash, you can have the health care. If you don't, oh, too bad. Would like just to kind of summarize major points. So property and production. All production is reducible to land and labor. Control of the land equals control of labor. But being central to economics, land disappeared from the discussion. It became just another commodity within the capital fund. But without understanding land, we cannot understand culture, economics. And there's been a consistent arc of history. So we have 5 types of property: communal, personal, private, cooperative, and collective. I should say these are the 5 types of natural property. There are created these forms are infinite. Intellectual property or equities, things like totally artificial. History shows us a consistent path, a movement from communal and personal property to private and collective. And economic rents, oh, it says economic tents, that's interesting. Economic tents come to dominate the economy. And this property tends to be accumulated in fewer and fewer hands. And the people are reduced to job dependency or outright serfdom. And eventually this stabilizes the whole economic order. Natural and conventional property, we must distinguish between man-made and obey different laws. Natural property is allocated by convention, positive law. Private property always depends on government. All physical property, all land traces back to the right of, and it always leads to economic. So, private property in common use. Private property is a human addition to the natural law. Very useful addition. We really all want to own some private property. I would prefer to call it personal property, but either way, we all need some property to live. However, property never loses its common aspect. Things may be owned privately, but they should be used as if they were common. And for St. Thomas at least, necessity makes all things common, and I suspect that's true for all of us if we find ourselves in the right circumstance. Wrong circumstance. Economic rent. Natural property always gets an economic rent. This is the law. This is because price doesn't control supply. It only controls intensity of use. So land then always gets a monopoly price, basically. But raising the price of land doesn't produce more land. It gets the land you have more intensely used, so If land costs $1 a square foot, then you feel comfortable building a storage shed on it. But if it costs $10,000 a square foot, well, you're going to need to erect, say, an office building or an apartment building. The value of the land comes from the community, not the owner, but the owner appropriates that. Therefore, it is the unearned increment. And this represents an irreducible inefficiency in any economy subject to economic. And it allows one class to accumulate wealth without providing any value. Now, only ownership of land allows capital or labor to get their full. But ownership has been concentrated in huge collectives called corporations. Private property plays very little role in. The owners of these collectives are the ones least attached to the enterprise. For most of us, we don't even. So this leads to diminished competition, less freedom. Let's think about why are we discussing property? The question has disappeared from modern economics. Should we just let it disappear? This question is a constant theme of the social encyclical. We are going to start reading those encyclicals with our next. So we're entering a new phase. These encyclicals really cannot be understood apart from. So what I would like you to do is to compare your notions with what you've heard in this, because I'm quite sure you're going to find some tension between, what you received with what you heard here. That's okay. Bring those tensions up. Bring those questions up. Bring if you have some strong pushback, that's fine. No problem. So we'll when we get together for the study group and on the discussion boards, feel free to go after. All right. So look forward to seeing you then in our discussion, and both in person and on